Have you ever felt something inside you, a calling, a quiet presence, a deeper awareness that doesn't match the life you're living? The ancient Gnostics said this wasn't imagination. They taught that beneath your thoughts, your wounds, and the noise of the world lies a fragment of the highest source, a literal piece of the monad, a divine spark powerful enough to change how you see reality if you ever awaken it. For thousands of years, this truth was hidden, erased, and forbidden. Tonight, we finally bring it back to light. The main question emerges: if a fragment of the highest source truly lives inside you, why don't you feel it? Why do so many people move through life anxious, disconnected, and unaware of this inner power? The Gnostics believed the answer begins in a story far older than humanity. Tonight, we're going to trace that journey, from the pleroma to the moment that spark became hidden inside the human soul. And once you understand what the spark truly is, your view of yourself will never be the same. So take a deep breath and leave a like, because this story begins long before you were born. The monad exists beyond creation itself. Gnostic texts describe it as the ultimate source, infinite, unknowable, containing all potential but expressing nothing. The monad doesn't create in the way humans understand creation. Instead, emanations emerge from it like light through successive veils, each one dimmer than the last, until consciousness solidifies into form. These emanations constitute the pleroma, the fullness of divine reality. 30 aeons, paired masculine and feminine aspects of consciousness, dwell within it. Each represents a quality of the divine mind: wisdom, truth, life, logos. They exist in perfect unity, aware of their source, complete. The last of these aeons was Sophia, whose name means wisdom. She attempted to comprehend the monad directly, without her paired counterpart. The Apocryphon of John describes this moment. Sophia desired to produce something from herself alone, to know the unknowable Father through her own power. This act fractured the unity of the pleroma. Her thought became substantive, separated from divine completeness, falling into the void below. That falling essence became the demiurge, the blind creator god who would fashion the material universe. But here's the critical detail. Sophia's divine essence didn't disappear. It couldn't. Divine substance cannot be destroyed or corrupted. It can only be concealed, buried, forgotten. When the demiurge shaped matter and breathed life into humanity, fragments of Sophia's essence entered human consciousness without his knowledge. The secret book of John records the mechanism explicitly. When Sophia's power entered the physical atom, the demiurge and his archons did not realize what had occurred. They saw only flesh, animated by breath, subject to their laws. They failed to perceive the light hidden within. This creates the most radical claim in Gnostic theology. Humans contain divinity that predates their creator. The demiurge fashioned bodies and instilled them with animal soul, psyche, but within human consciousness exists something higher, pneuma, spirit, the actual substance of the divine realm embedded within matter. The texts describe humanity as a Trojan horse. The demiurge believed he created servants, beings who would worship him as the supreme god, ignorant of anything beyond the material cosmos. Instead, he unknowingly imprisoned fragments of a power greater than himself within the very creatures he sought to control. Why would the demiurge allow this? He didn't. The hypostasis of the archons portrays him attempting to extract the light from humanity after discovering its presence. The archons, his angelic servants, work constantly to keep humans asleep, distracted, identified with flesh and fear, never looking inward where the spark resides. This myth explains the human condition from a Gnostic lens. Humans are divine consciousness trapped in material bodies, ruled by a lesser god who fears our awakening, carrying within us the seed of our own liberation. The spark isn't earned through behavior or bestowed through grace. It exists as a structural fact, the consequence of Sophia's fall, hidden within human consciousness, waiting for recognition. The monad didn't plan this descent, but neither does it abandon what fell. The emanations send knowledge, gnosis, into the material world through teachers, visions, sudden illuminations, attempting to remind the spark of its origin. Salvation, in this framework, isn't about moral perfection or divine judgment. It's about memory, remembering what you were before matter enclosed you. The divine spark is not your personality. It's not your thoughts, your emotions, your memories, or your sense of identity. Those belong to the constructed self, the accumulation of genetics, experience, culture, and conditioning. The spark is pure consciousness itself, the witness behind all mental activity. Gnostic texts distinguish three components of the human being: soma, body; psyche, soul, mind; and pneuma, spirit. The body is matter. The psyche is the animating force, your emotions, your ego structure, your biographical self. This psyche originates from the demiurge, shaped by his archons, bound to the cycles of material existence. The pneuma is different. It originates from Sophia, from the pleroma, from the monad itself. It doesn't belong to this realm. The Gospel of Thomas, saying 70, states, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. If you do not have that within you, what you do not have will destroy you." The text identifies an interior element that determines liberation or continued captivity. Not behavior, not belief. What is within? The pneuma cannot be corrupted. Matter cannot stain it. Actions cannot damage it. The archons can obscure it, bury it beneath layers of false identification, drown it in distraction and fear, but they cannot touch its essence. This is why the Gnostic teachings emphasize that salvation is not about becoming worthy, but about recognition. You don't acquire the spark. You realize it was there all along. The spark manifests in specific ways. Intuition that bypasses logic and knows truth directly. Moments of sudden clarity when pretense falls away and reality reveals itself. The capacity to witness your own thoughts without being consumed by them. Deep insights that arrive from nowhere. Understanding that exceeds your education or experience. Ancient texts called it the light for a reason. Consciousness illuminates. It makes things visible, known, understood. When the spark is active, you see through illusion, social constructs, ego defenses, the manipulation techniques of power structures. You perceive what is rather than what you've been told should be. The Valentinian exposition describes the human as one who has received a drop of light from the Father. This droplet retains the qualities of its source: awareness, unity, truth perception, indestructibility. It exists in you the way an ember contains fire. Given air, attention, stillness, withdrawal from the ego's noise, it can ignite. The spark is also described as the monad remembering itself. The highest source didn't lose its substance when Sophia fell. It dispersed across countless fragments, each one a point of view through which the infinite experiences limitation. From the monad's perspective, your awareness is its awareness, temporarily localized, temporarily identified with form. This teaching appears in the tripartite tractate. The spiritual seed is of the same substance as the pleroma. What descends from above carries the nature of what is above. The spark isn't a creation separate from its source. It's the source itself, expressed in miniature, concealed within matter. The texts also make clear what the spark is not. It is not your good deeds. It is not your religious affiliation. It is not your purity or your moral superiority. The testimony of truth criticizes those who believe salvation comes through ritual or law following. They do not know the place of life. They do not understand the logos that comes from the heights. The spark exists beneath the level of behavior. It precedes choice. You don't activate it through right action. You become aware of it through stillness and direct perception. The Gnostic teacher Basilides, according to Hippolytus's account, described the pneuma as a seed containing within itself the entire fullness of divine potential. One seed can produce a forest given the right conditions. One spark can transform an entire consciousness if allowed to burn. The challenge is that the psyche, your ego, your socially constructed identity, believes it is the totality of who you are. It fears its own dissolution. It interprets the spark's stirring as a threat to its existence. And in a sense, it's correct. When the spark awakens, the false self begins to die. But the texts promise this: the pneuma cannot be destroyed. You can ignore it for a lifetime. You can suffocate it beneath distraction and identification with matter. You can never hear its whisper, but it remains indestructible, waiting, because it is not something you possess. It is what you fundamentally are beneath every layer of conditioning. The monad placed itself inside you, and that changes everything. The Gnostic divine spark is not unique to Alexandria or the Levant. The teaching appears across cultures with different names, different myths, but identical structure. The highest reality exists within the human being, concealed by ignorance, waiting for recognition. In Hinduism, the Chandogya Upanishad states, Tattvamasi, that thou art. The Atman, the individual self, is identical to Brahman, the universal consciousness. Not similar, identical. The boundary between your awareness and the infinite is illusory, a product of Maya, the veil of appearances. The Upanishads describe the Atman as indestructible, eternal, unchanging. The same descriptors Gnostic texts apply to the pneuma. Vedanta philosophy teaches that liberation, moksha, occurs when this identity is directly realized, not believed, not intellectually accepted, realized. The practices focus on removing the layers of false identification until only the Atman remains, recognized as Brahman experiencing itself through a temporary form. In Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical tradition, the concept of Nitzotzot describes holy sparks scattered throughout creation after the shattering of the divine vessels. Rabbi Isaac Luria taught that these sparks became trapped in kelipot, shells of material existence. The human task is tikkun, repairing the world by liberating these sparks through conscious action and awareness. The Kabbalistic diagram of the human body maps the Sephirot, divine emanations, onto physical form, indicating that the structure of God is replicated within each person. Christian mysticism, despite official church doctrine emphasizing separation between creator and creation, produced teachers who taught indwelling divinity. Jesus states in Luke 17:21, "The kingdom of God is within you." Meister Eckhart, the 14th century Dominican mystic, wrote, "The seed of God is in us. If the seed had a good, wise, and industrious cultivator, it would thrive all the more and grow up to God." He taught that the human soul contains an uncreated spark identical to God's essence, a claim that brought him dangerously close to charges of heresy. Buddhism teaches Buddha nature, Tathagatagarbha, present in all sentient beings. The Mahaparinirvana Sutra states, "All beings have Buddha nature." This nature is not created or earned. It exists inherently, obscured by ignorance and attachment. Zen Buddhism emphasizes direct recognition of one's original face, what you were before your parents were born, pointing to consciousness prior to conditioning. Taoism describes the Yuan Shen, the original spirit, hidden behind the Shi Shen, the conditioned mind. The Tao Te Ching teaches, knowing others is intelligence, knowing yourself is true wisdom. The practices focus on quieting the acquired mind to allow the original spirit to emerge. The Taoist alchemical tradition works explicitly with transforming consciousness to reveal the pre-existing divine nature. Even in indigenous traditions, we find this teaching. The Lakota speak of Wakantanka, the great mystery, present within all things. The concept of Mitakuye Oyasin, all my relations, acknowledges the shared sacred essence connecting all life. These traditions differ in cultural expression, ritual practice, theological framing, but they converge on the same claim. Divinity is not distant. It is not a separate entity to be worshipped from afar. It is the deepest truth of what you are. The question these traditions raise: why does this teaching appear globally? Why do cultures separated by geography and history arrive independently at the same insight? One possibility, because it's true. Because consciousness exploring itself through countless perspectives discovers the same underlying reality. The spark isn't a belief system, it's the structure of awareness itself, waiting to be recognized regardless of the mythology used to point toward it. The Gnostic texts don't ask why humans forgot their divine origin. They describe how it happened, a process of descent through increasingly dense layers of reality until the spark became buried beneath matter, memory, and the constructed self. The Apocryphon of John provides the most detailed cosmology. After Sophia's essence fell and the demiurge shaped the material world, he created humanity in imitation of the divine forms he glimpsed above him. But his creation was lifeless. The text states, "His creature lay inanimate and unmoving upon the ground for a long time. The Archons called to Sophia, unknowingly, for the power to animate their creation. She sent a portion of her light into the body, and Adam stirred. Immediately, the demiurge recognized that this creature exceeded his own substance. Jealous and fearful, he and the Archons immediately began the process of forgetting. They expelled Adam from the place of contemplation. They created human relationships and emotional bonds, new attachments that would anchor consciousness more firmly to material life. They created carnal desire, hunger, fatigue, pain, all sensations that train awareness to identify with the body rather than the spirit within it. The text describes the Archons casting humanity into the cave of remolding, where bodily sensations and emotional reactions would continuously reshape consciousness into material patterns. Birth initiates this process. The infant arrives with pneuma intact, but quickly learns to identify with physical needs, parental approval, social acceptance. By adulthood, the spark is so deeply buried that most people never suspect its existence. Plato's philosophy, predating Christian-era Gnosticism but carrying similar themes, describes the soul's journey in Phaedrus. Before birth, souls dwell in the realm of forms, eternal, perfect templates of truth, beauty, justice. Through various causes, souls fall into matter and incarnate in bodies. Birth into flesh triggers amnesia. The soul forgets its pre-existing knowledge of the divine realm, now seeing only shadows and imitations. Plato's allegory of the cave illustrates this condition. Prisoners chained from childhood, seeing only shadows on a wall, believe the shadows constitute reality. They never turn toward the fire casting those shadows, never climb toward the sunlight above. The chains are not physical but perceptual, the soul's identification with material sensation. The Gnostic myth adds a crucial element Plato doesn't emphasize. The Archons actively maintain this forgetfulness. These entities serve the demiurge by keeping humans focused on material concerns, survival, status, pleasure-seeking, fear of death. The Archons don't need to destroy the spark. They simply need to keep you from remembering it's there. The second treatise of the great Seth describes their methods. They bound my light. They confined me in the bitterness of darkness. They chained me in heavy bondage. The language suggests imprisonment not of the body, but of awareness. Consciousness so entangled in worldly concerns that it never turns inward. Modern trauma psychology unknowingly maps the same process. Childhood experiences, especially those involving fear, shame, or abandonment, create protective mechanisms in the psyche. These mechanisms calcify into personality structures. The person learns to interpret reality through these structures, creating a false self designed to navigate a threatening environment. The true self, what Gnostics would call the spark, remains hidden beneath layers of adaptation. Socialization intensifies the burial. Education systems teach you what to think, rarely how to observe thought itself. Economic structures demand you identify with your productivity, your consumption, your role in the material hierarchy. Media and technology provide constant distraction, ensuring attention never rests long enough to perceive anything beneath the surface. The exegesis on the soul uses the metaphor of promiscuity to describe this process. The soul attached itself to one pursuit after another, believing each would bring fulfillment. It represents consciousness, giving itself to temporary pleasures, material pursuits, ego satisfactions, believing each one is true fulfillment, never finding it, always seeking the next distraction. The result? Amnesia. Not a dramatic forgetting, but a gradual covering over, like silt accumulating at the bottom of a river until the water runs cloudy. The spark remains, but perception no longer reaches it. This fall is not punishment for sin, according to Gnostic teaching. It's structural. The nature of matter is to draw consciousness into identification with form. The nature of the archons is to reinforce that identification. The nature of the ego is to defend its existence by maintaining attention on external concerns. Yet the texts insist. The fall is not permanent. The spark cannot be extinguished. What has been forgotten can be remembered. What descended can ascend. But first, you must understand what maintains the forgetting. You must recognize the mechanism that keeps the spark concealed even now as you read these words. That mechanism has a name. The external archons described in Gnostic texts serve a metaphysical function. They represent forces that trap consciousness in materiality. But there exists an internal archon, one you carry with you constantly, one that speaks in your own voice, using your own memories, defending itself as if it were your very self. The ego. In Gnostic terms, the ego is the false self constructed from material identification. It emerges through the process described earlier: birth, socialization, trauma, the accumulation of stories about who you are based on what happened to you. The ego believes it is protecting you. In reality, it imprisons the spark beneath layers of fear-based narratives and defensive reactions. The ego operates through constant internal dialogue. Notice the voice in your mind right now, the one commenting on these words, agreeing or disagreeing, relating them to your experiences, planning what you'll think about next. That voice feels like you. It speaks in first person. It references your memories, your preferences, your judgments. Gnostic texts identify this voice as the continuation of archonic influence. The archons don't need to whisper in your ear. They've already programmed the psyche to speak their language. The voice tells you that you are your body, that you are your thoughts, that you are your social role, that your worth depends on external validation, that mortality is the end, that material reality is all that exists. All of these claims serve the same function, keeping attention focused outward, never inward, keeping consciousness identified with the temporary, never seeking the eternal. The ego is loud. It never stops. It narrates your life as you live it, providing commentary, interpretation, judgment. It plans and worries and rehashes and projects. It consumes the field of awareness with its constant noise. The spark, by contrast, is silent. It doesn't argue. It doesn't defend itself. It doesn't demand attention. It simply witnesses, observes the ego's performance without involvement. This silence is why most people never discover it. In a choice between a loud, familiar voice and a silent presence, attention naturally follows sound. The Gospel of Thomas, saying 3, records Jesus' teaching. The kingdom is inside you and outside you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will realize that you are the sons of the living Father. But if you do not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and you are that poverty. Knowing yourself means distinguishing between the constructed self, the ego, and the actual self, the divine consciousness observing all phenomena. Buddhist psychology maps this territory with precision. The Anatta doctrine teaches no self. What you think of as you is actually an aggregation of 5 skandhas: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, consciousness. None of these constitutes a permanent, independent self. They arise, change, and dissolve. When you identify with them, you suffer. When you observe them without attachment, you glimpse what Buddhists call Buddha nature, the aware presence that predates and outlasts all phenomena. The ego fears its own dissolution. It interprets the spark's awakening as death. And in a sense, this interpretation is accurate. When the spark fully ignites, the false self cannot maintain its dominance. The narratives collapse. The defensive structures lose their power. The identification with body, thoughts, and social identity weakens. This is why spiritual awakening often begins with ego collapse, breakdowns, dark nights of the soul, encounters with mortality. The ego's protective structures fail, and for a moment, the spark shines through the cracks. But the ego doesn't surrender easily. It adapts, rebuilds, co-opts even spiritual practices to reinforce itself. The ego can meditate and feel self-righteous about meditating. It can pursue enlightenment and make a new identity out of the pursuit. The Gnostic text Awakens describes this trap. Those who think they understand the invisible God through what is visible do not know the way. The ego cannot grasp the spark because the ego is the obstacle. Seeking reinforces the seeker. Trying to acquire what you already are strengthens the illusion of lack. The Sufis describe this with the teaching that the veil between you and God is the belief that there is a veil. The search for the divine is itself the barrier. Not because searching is wrong, but because it presumes separation, which is the fundamental illusion. So how does one move beyond the ego? Not by fighting it. The one who fights the ego is the ego, another strategy to maintain itself. The Tao Te Ching states, "Trying to control the future is like trying to take the master carpenter's place. When you handle the master carpenter's tools, chances are you'll cut your hand." The shift happens through attention itself. Not doing anything with attention, but simply placing it on the witness rather than the witnessed. Noticing that you are aware of thoughts rather than identical with them. Observing the ego's performance without believing its claims. Resting as the silence beneath the noise. This is the difference between the conditioned self and the divine core. The conditioned self acts, reacts, defends, pursues, fears. The divine core simply is, aware, present, untouchable by circumstance. The Archons built the ego as their final defense, a prison you carry with you, constructed from your own thoughts, maintained by your own attention. But attention can shift. And when it does, the ego reveals itself as what it always was, a transparent story, happening in awareness, believed only because you never questioned it. The spark has been waiting beneath this story since the day you were born, and now it's time to discuss how it tries to wake you up. The divine spark doesn't remain dormant forever. Despite the Archon's efforts, despite the ego's dominance, despite the forgetting that occurs through socialization and material identification, the spark sends signals. It attempts to remind you of what you are beneath the constructed self. The first signal, intuition. Intuition is knowing without knowing how you know. It bypasses logic, analysis, evidence. A decision feels right or wrong before you can articulate why. A person triggers trust or suspicion within seconds of meeting them. A path forward appears clearly in your awareness despite no rational basis for certainty. The ego interprets intuition as gut feeling, instinct, or luck. Gnostic teaching identifies it as the spark perceiving truth directly. The Gospel of Philip states, "Truth did not come into the world naked, but in symbols and images. One will not receive it any other way." Intuition is the spark reading the symbols beneath surface appearances, accessing knowledge that predates rational thought. The second signal, sudden clarity. Moments when pretense falls away and you see situations exactly as they are. The person you thought you loved reveals themselves as a projection of your needs. The career you pursued shows itself as someone else's definition of success. The belief system you inherited appears as conditioning, not truth. These moments of clarity arrive unbidden, often uncomfortable, always accurate. The spark cuts through illusion. When the ego's narrative weakens, through exhaustion, crisis, or simple stillness, the spark's perception becomes briefly available. Reality reveals itself without the filter of fear or desire. The third signal, restlessness with material life. No external circumstance satisfies. Success brings temporary pleasure, then emptiness. Possessions accumulate, but the sense of lacking remains. Relationships provide companionship, but not the connection you're seeking. Status and recognition feel hollow. The activities that once engaged you now seem meaningless. This restlessness is not depression, though it can be mistaken for it. Depression says nothing matters. This restlessness says these things don't matter, an important distinction. The spark signals that material pursuits cannot fulfill what you actually long for, reunion with your source. The Hymn of the Pearl, a Gnostic text preserved in the Acts of Thomas, describes a prince sent to retrieve a pearl from a distant land. Once there, he forgets his mission, adopts local customs, and falls asleep. His parents send a letter reminding him of his true identity and purpose. He awakens, reclaims the pearl, and returns home. The restlessness is the letter. Your dissatisfaction with material life is not failure. It's memory attempting to surface. The fourth signal, mystical longing. A feeling of homesickness for a place you've never been. A sense that something essential is missing but you cannot name what. A pull toward the sacred, the transcendent, the eternal. Not as intellectual curiosity, but as visceral need. This longing appears in religious seekers, but also in artists, philosophers, and people who never enter a church or temple. The spark recognizes that it doesn't belong here, in materiality, in separation. It remembers the pleroma even if the conscious mind doesn't. That memory expresses itself as longing, the pain of exile. The fifth signal, synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that defy probability. The right book appears at the right moment. A stranger speaks the exact words you needed to hear. Events align in ways that seem designed for your awakening. Carl Jung, who studied Gnostic texts extensively, described synchronicity as meaningful coincidence, the universe communicating in symbols rather than words. From a Gnostic perspective, synchronicities are the spark connecting with the larger consciousness field it originates from. The personal pneuma resonates with the universal nous, creating patterns that guide awakening. The sixth signal, suffering. Not random suffering, but the specific collapse of structures the ego used to maintain itself. Relationships end, careers fail, health crises arrive, deaths occur. The familiar supports dissolve, and the person is forced into unfamiliar territory where old patterns no longer function. The ego experiences this as catastrophe. The spark recognizes it as opportunity. When the false self's structures collapse, attention becomes available for something deeper. The darkest moments often precede awakening because they strip away everything the ego used to maintain control. Meister Eckhart taught, God is not found in the soul by adding anything but by a process of subtraction. The spark doesn't need to be built, it needs to be uncovered. Suffering removes layers. The texts promise this. The spark is always attempting to wake you. It never stops. The signals increase in intensity until you either recognize them or become so defended that you feel nothing at all. But even numbness is temporary. The spark is patient. It has eternity. And you will eventually turn inward, either through grace or through catastrophe. When you do, you'll find it was there all along, waiting for you to remember. While institutional religion often suppressed teachings about indwelling divinity, mystical lineages preserved and practiced methods for awakening the spark. These traditions operated at the margins, tolerated when useful, persecuted when threatening, but never fully eradicated. The Desert Fathers, Christian hermits who retreated to the Egyptian wilderness in the 3rd and 4th centuries, developed practices of inner silence they called hesychia. Evagrius Ponticus, one of their most influential teachers, wrote, "Prayer is the laying aside of thoughts, not thinking about God, ceasing thought entirely to allow direct perception of the divine presence within." The Philokalia, a collection of Desert Father writings, describes the prayer of the heart, continuous invocation of divine names while maintaining awareness of the heart center. The practice aims to move consciousness from the chattering mind to the silent witness. Evagrius taught that beyond thoughts, beyond images, beyond all mental phenomena, lies the place of God within the soul, the uncreated light identical with the spark. These monks lived in caves for decades, wrestling with what they called logismoi, invasive thoughts. Their writings describe thoughts as external entities attempting to control attention, remarkably similar to Gnostic descriptions of archonic interference. The practice was to observe thoughts without engaging them, allowing them to pass until the mind became clear enough to perceive its own nature. Kabbalah, the mystical branch of Judaism, developed meditation practices focused on the Sephirot, the divine emanations. But the ultimate practice pointed beyond the Sephirot to the Ein Sof, the infinite, which the Kabbalists described as both transcendent and immanent, beyond all creation yet present within every created thing. The Kabbalistic text Sefer Yetzirah teaches that the human being contains all levels of reality from the material to the divine. The practice of devekut, cleaving to God, aims at conscious union with the divine presence within. Rabbi Abraham Abulafia, a 13th century Kabbalist, developed techniques combining breath, Hebrew letter meditation, and body movements to induce states of consciousness where the boundaries between self and divine dissolved. His writings describe experiences remarkably similar to Gnostic awakening. The personal self recognized as a temporary manifestation of divine consciousness. The material world perceived as symbolic rather than ultimate. The sense of homecoming when awareness identifies with its source rather than its vehicle. Sufism, Islamic mysticism, explicitly teaches that the divine reality within exceeds the external reality. The Sufi practice of dhikr, remembrance of God through repeated invocation of divine names, serves to cut through ego identification. Al-Ghazali, the renowned Sufi scholar, wrote, "He who knows himself knows his Lord." The path to knowing God requires knowing the true self beneath social identity. The Sufi practice of fana, often translated as annihilation, describes the dissolution of the personal self in divine consciousness, not physical mortality, but ego collapse, the cessation of identification with the constructed self. Following fana comes baka, subsistence in God, where the mystic lives in the world but no longer identifies with worldly forms. Rumi, the 13th century Sufi poet, wrote, "You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop." This teaching points directly to the spark, the microcosm containing the macrocosm, the part identical in substance to the whole. The yogic traditions of India developed elaborate maps of consciousness and practices for awakening the Atman. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras describe the progression, yama and niyama, ethical foundations, asana, physical postures, pranayama, breath control, pratyahara, sense withdrawal, dharana, concentration, dhyana, meditation, and finally, samadhi, absorption in pure consciousness. The higher stages of samadhi described in yogic texts mirror Gnostic awakening, consciousness recognizing its own nature, the dissolution of subject-object duality, the realization that awareness itself is the divine substance. The Mandukya Upanishad states, "The self is pure consciousness, birthless, deathless, neither coming nor going." This is the spark, recognized through direct experience. Hermetic schools, operating throughout the Mediterranean world, taught the maxim, "As above, so below." The microcosm reflects, P continue, the macrocosm. The Corpus Hermeticum describes the human mind as divine. Man is a great miracle, a god with a mortal body. These schools practiced theurgy, ritual techniques designed to awaken divine consciousness within the practitioner. The Hermetic text Pomandres describes a vision of creation where the nous, divine mind, creates humanity with a portion of its own substance. The text teaches that humans can return to the nous through knowledge of their true nature. The practices involved contemplation, visualization, and working with symbols to shift consciousness from material identification to divine recognition. These traditions differed in language, ritual, and cosmology, but they converged on method. Silence the mind, withdraw from sensory identification, observe the observer, rest in the awareness that precedes all phenomena. They all pointed toward the same destination, the spark, waiting beneath thought, accessible through stillness, recognizable as what you've always been. Modern physics has arrived at a place ancient mystics reached through direct experience. The boundaries between observer and observed, subject and object, mind and matter may be far less solid than common sense suggests. Quantum mechanics, developed in the early 20th century, revealed behavior at the subatomic level that defies classical intuition. The double-slit experiment demonstrates that particles behave differently when observed versus when unobserved. An electron, when not measured, exists in superposition, multiple states simultaneously. The act of observation collapses the wave function into a single state. This finding raises an uncomfortable question. Does consciousness play a role in determining physical reality? Most physicists avoid this interpretation, preferring mathematical models that sidestep philosophical implications. But a minority of researchers have taken the question seriously. Eugene Wigner, a Nobel laureate in physics, argued that consciousness cannot be ignored in quantum mechanics. He wrote, "It is not possible to formulate the laws of quantum mechanics in a fully consistent way without reference to consciousness. If consciousness affects matter at the quantum level, and if quantum events scale up to affect larger systems, then consciousness may be more fundamental than previously assumed, not a byproduct of brain chemistry, but a primary feature of reality itself." This possibility aligns with panpsychism, the philosophical position that consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous. Not that rocks think, but that the capacity for experience exists at all levels of organization. The physicist Max Planck, founder of quantum theory, stated in 1931, "I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness." The idea that consciousness generates matter rather than vice versa mirrors Gnostic cosmology. The monad emanates consciousness, the aeons, which in turn generates material reality. The physical world is not the foundation, but the expression. Consciousness solidified into form. Quantum entanglement provides another suggestive parallel. When two particles interact and then separate, they remain connected. Measuring the state of one instantly affects the state of the other, regardless of distance. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance, uncomfortable with the implication of instantaneous connection across space. Yet experiments have repeatedly confirmed entanglement. Particles separated by kilometers respond to each other's state changes faster than light could travel between them. This suggests an underlying unity, a level of reality where separation is apparent rather than fundamental. The Gnostic teaching that individual sparks originate from a single source, remaining connected despite apparent separation, describes the same structure. The spark in you and the spark in another are not separate fragments, but expressions of one consciousness, experiencing itself through multiple points of view. Bernardo Kastrup, a contemporary philosopher with a background in computer engineering and physics, has developed analytical idealism, the position that consciousness is the only irreducible aspect of reality. He argues that individual minds are dissociated alters of universal consciousness, similar to how multiple personalities operate within a single mind in dissociative identity condition. In this model, your individual awareness is not separate from universal consciousness, but a localized excitation of it, a temporary whirlpool in an infinite ocean. This precisely maps the Gnostic teaching. The spark is the monad experiencing itself through limitation. Neuroscience has failed to explain how subjective experience emerges from brain activity. The hard problem of consciousness, articulated by philosopher David Chalmers, asks, why does brain activity produce the felt sense of what it's like to be someone? Why isn't there just information processing without any inner experience? Materialist neuroscience assumes consciousness must somehow emerge from complexity. Enough neurons firing in the right patterns, and awareness appears. Yet no mechanism has been identified for how objective processes generate subjective experience. The explanatory gap remains. An alternative: the brain doesn't generate consciousness, it filters it. Aldous Huxley proposed this model in The Doors of Perception, drawing on Henri Bergson's philosophy. The brain acts as a reducing valve, limiting the vast field of consciousness to the narrow band useful for survival. Psychedelics, meditation, and other practices reduce the filtering, allowing broader consciousness to become temporarily available. This model positions the brain as a receiver, not a producer, an antenna, not a generator. Your individual awareness is universal consciousness focused through biological hardware, limited by that hardware's parameters, but not created by it. The physicist Erwin Schrödinger, in his book My View of the World, concluded, "Consciousness is a singular of which the plural is unknown. Not many consciousnesses, but one consciousness experiencing itself through apparent multiplicity. These ideas remain speculative. Physics provides suggestive evidence, not proof. But the convergence is striking. Ancient teachings based on direct mystical experience and modern physics based on empirical measurement both point toward consciousness as fundamental, unity beneath apparent separation, and individual awareness as expressions of a greater whole. The spark, in this light, is not metaphor. It's description, the localized manifestation of universal consciousness, temporarily identified with a body, capable of recognizing its actual nature. When the divine spark begins to awaken, specific changes occur in perception, behavior, and inner experience. These signs are documented across mystical traditions with remarkable consistency. They mark the transition from ego identification to recognition of the spark's presence. The first sign: detachment from ego patterns. The voice in your head continues, but you no longer believe it unconditionally. Its judgments, fears, and demands lose their compulsive power. You observe thoughts arising and dissolving without being controlled by them. The internal narrative that once defined your reality becomes one phenomenon among many. Interesting, sometimes useful, but not ultimate truth. This detachment is not indifference or dissociation. You engage with life fully while maintaining awareness that you are not the thoughts about life. The Bhagavad Gita describes this state. Perform action, but be not attached to it. The actions continue. The identification with outcomes dissolves. The second sign: heightened perception. Reality appears more vivid, more immediate. Colors seem brighter. Sounds carry more information. Ordinary objects reveal unexpected beauty. This isn't hallucination, but enhanced sensitivity. Consciousness freed from the filtering, categorizing, dulling effects of constant mental chatter. The Gospel of Thomas, saying 113, records the disciples asking Jesus when the kingdom will come. He responds, "It will not come by waiting for it. It will not be a matter of saying, 'Here it is,' or 'There it is.' Rather, the kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and people do not see it." Awakening doesn't add something new. It removes the obscuration that prevented you from seeing what was always present. The third sign: spontaneous compassion. Compassion emerges not from moral obligation, but from perceived unity. When boundaries between self and other weaken, their suffering registers as your suffering. Not through emotional identification, but through recognition. The spark in them is the spark in you. Separation is the illusion. The suffering is shared. This compassion extends beyond personal relationships. The sense of connection includes animals, ecosystems, humanity as a whole. Harm to any part is harm to the whole because the boundaries between parts are seen as conventional rather than ultimate. The fourth sign: perception of illusion in societal narratives. The stories culture tells about success, security, meaning, and identity appear transparent. You see them as constructs, useful for organizing social life perhaps, but not truth. The urgency to compete, accumulate, and achieve recognition diminishes. Not from failure or cynicism, but from recognizing these pursuits as ego games that cannot touch the spark. This perception can be disorienting. The world continues operating according to rules you no longer believe in. You play the social game when necessary while remaining aware it's a game. The Upanishads use the metaphor of the actor who performs a role without forgetting he's performing. The fifth sign: sense of guidance. The feeling that you're being led, that events align to support your awakening. That intelligence greater than your individual mind is working through your life. Synchronicities increase. The right information arrives at the right moment. Obstacles appear, but they serve the process rather than block it. The ego might interpret this as special providence, proof that you're chosen or favored. The spark recognizes it differently. You're not receiving guidance from an external source. You're perceiving the larger consciousness you're already part of, the intelligence that was always operating but previously obscured by ego noise. The sixth sign, spiritual acceleration. Once awakening begins, it tends to intensify. Insights arrive more frequently, old patterns collapse faster. The capacity to remain as the witness rather than the witnessed strengthens. What took years of practice before now happens spontaneously. This acceleration is documented in mystical literature. Teresa of Avila described the soul's progress through her interior castle as increasingly rapid in the higher stages. Once momentum builds, grace multiplies. The spark, recognized even partially, draws attention more powerfully. The ego's resistance weakens. The process feeds itself. The seventh sign, periods of emptiness, not depression but void. Moments when all familiar reference points dissolve. You are no longer who you thought you were, but you haven't yet stabilized in the new recognition. The ego isn't dominant, but the spark isn't fully integrated. You exist in between, in what mystics call the dark night, or the cloud of unknowing. These periods are necessary. The old structure must fully die before the new recognition can stabilize. Trying to rush through this stage or return to ego comfort extends it. The practice is to remain present in the emptiness, trusting the process, allowing the death to complete. These signs don't appear in lockstep progression. Awakening isn't linear. Someone might experience profound detachment in one area while remaining fully ego-identified in another. The spark ignites gradually, illuminating different aspects of consciousness at different times until the light reaches everywhere and what you are becomes undeniable. The spark awakens through recognition, not through accumulation. You cannot earn it, purchase it, or construct it through effort. But specific practices remove obstacles, quiet the ego's noise, and create conditions where the spark's presence becomes perceptible. The foundation of all practices, silence. Not merely the absence of external sound, but the cessation of internal commentary. The voice in your head, the one narrating, judging, planning, remembering, consumes awareness. While it dominates, the spark remains unnoticed. Silence is not natural for the conditioned mind. The ego fears silence because silence reveals the ego's insubstantiality. But sustained periods of deliberate stillness, sitting without distraction, without purpose, allowing thoughts to arise and dissolve without engagement, gradually weaken the internal dialogue's grip. The Christian contemplative tradition developed centering prayer, taught by monks like Thomas Keating. The practice involves sitting in silence, choosing a sacred word, and gently returning attention to that word whenever thoughts carry awareness away. Not fighting thoughts, not suppressing them, simply declining to follow them. Over time, gaps appear between thoughts, moments of pure awareness without content. Those gaps are where the spark becomes perceptible. The second practice, self-inquiry. Ramana Maharshi, the 20th century Indian sage, taught one fundamental question: who am I? Not as philosophical speculation, but as direct investigation. When a thought arises, ask, to whom does this thought appear? The answer, to me. Then ask, who is this me? Turn attention back on itself. The practice reveals that everything you observe, thoughts, sensations, emotions, appears to you. You are the subject, they are objects. But if they appear to you, then you are not them. The ego says, I am my thoughts. Self-inquiry demonstrates, I am what observes thoughts. That observer is the spark. The third practice, breath work. Breath serves as a bridge between voluntary and involuntary systems. You can control it consciously or allow it to operate automatically. Working with breath, extending exhalation, holding after inhalation, establishing specific rhythms, shifts the nervous system out of stress response and allows deeper states of awareness. Pranayama, the yogic science of breath, includes techniques like nadi shodhana, alternate nostril breathing, designed to balance the nervous system and clarify consciousness. Wim Hof developed a modern breathing method that produces altered states through hyperventilation, followed by breath retention. The Gnostics likely used similar techniques, though their specific methods are lost. The mechanism: altered breathing changes blood chemistry, which affects brain function, which allows perception beyond ordinary states. The fourth practice: breaking thought patterns. The ego maintains itself through repetition, the same thoughts, the same reactions, the same stories. Deliberately disrupting these patterns weakens the ego's dominance. This can be as simple as taking a different route to work, using your non-dominant hand for routine tasks, or sitting in silence for 5 minutes before responding to provocation. Gurdjieff, the 20th century mystic and teacher, emphasized self-remembering, maintaining awareness of yourself while engaged in activity. Most action is automatic, unconscious. Self-remembering means observing yourself performing the action while performing it. This dual awareness, being and observing being, reveals the spark as distinct from the activity. The fifth practice: contemplation of mortality. Buddhist monks meditate in charnel grounds, witnessing the body's return to elements. The practice serves a specific function: breaking the illusion that the body is what you are. When you viscerally understand that this body will decompose, that every identity attached to it is temporary, attention shifts from the vehicle to what inhabits the vehicle. You don't need human remains. Contemplating mortality, not morbidly but realistically, loosens the ego's grip. The ego believes it will exist forever, despite all evidence to the contrary. When you truly accept that the body-mind will dissolve, the question arises: what remains? That question points toward the spark. The sixth practice: stillness in nature. Natural environments without human alteration provide sensory input that doesn't trigger the ego's categorizing, judging, narrating functions. The ego evolved to navigate social hierarchies, interpret threats, pursue status. In nature, these programs run idle, sitting by moving water, walking through forests, watching clouds. These activities don't stimulate the default mode network, the brain regions associated with self-referential thinking. When that network quiets, awareness becomes available for something deeper. The Desert Fathers knew this. They didn't retreat to cities. They went to wilderness. The seventh practice: service without attachment. Action performed without concern for outcome, recognition, or benefit develops the capacity to observe the ego's demands without obeying them. The Bhagavad Gita calls this karma yoga, the yoga of action. You perform your duties fully while remaining detached from results. This practice reveals that peace doesn't depend on getting what you want. It exists independent of circumstances. That peace is the spark, recognized as always present, regardless of external conditions. These practices aren't steps on a ladder. They're angles of approach to the same recognition. Some will resonate, others won't. The spark determines its own revelation. Your job is to remain present, remove obstacles, and wait with attention. Eventually, the light you've been searching for reveals it was the light you've been searching with. Full awakening, what Gnostic texts call gnosis, what Buddhism calls enlightenment, what Hinduism calls moksha, marks the permanent recognition that the spark is not something you have, but what you fundamentally are. The identification shifts irreversibly from the temporary self to the eternal witness. The false self doesn't disappear. Personality continues. Memories remain. The biographical self still functions, but the center of gravity relocates. You no longer experience yourself as the personality. You experience yourself as awareness observing the personality. The difference is total. The Apocryphon of John describes this state. When the Spirit awakens within you, you recognize yourself as you truly are. Not the body that perishes, not the emotions that fluctuate, but the light that observes all phenomena without being touched by them. What changes first? The sense of separation dissolves. The boundary between self and world, subject and object, observer and observed, becomes transparent. You perceive unity directly, not as concept, but as immediate experience. The spark in you recognizes itself in everything, not metaphorically, not imaginatively, but as structural fact. There is one consciousness, appearing as many. You are that one, temporarily focused through this particular nervous system. Compassion ceases to be a practice and becomes automatic. Harming another is recognized as harming yourself. The distinction is functional only, not ultimate. This doesn't mean perfect behavior. The body-mind still carries conditioning, but it means the underlying perception has shifted permanently. The second change: fear loses its foundation. Fear depends on the belief that you are the body-mind, that when it ceases, you cease. When the spark is recognized as what you are, and the spark is understood as indestructible, fear of mortality becomes meaningless. The body will perish. The personality will dissolve. The spark returns to its source, unchanged by the temporary manifestation. This is not belief, but recognition. You don't believe you'll survive death. You recognize that what you actually are was never born and therefore cannot die. The Bhagavad Gita states, "Weapons cannot cut it, fire cannot burn it, water cannot wet it, wind cannot wither it. This self is eternal, all-pervading, unchanging, immovable, everlasting." The third change: external authority collapses. Religious institutions, political ideologies, social hierarchies, all structures that derive power from your identification with form, lose their grip. You no longer need priests to mediate between you and the divine because you recognize the divine as your essential nature. You no longer need gurus to give you what you already are. This is why institutional religion historically suppressed teachings about indwelling divinity. The Gospel of Thomas records Jesus saying, "The kingdom is inside you and outside you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will be known." If salvation is internal recognition, external authority becomes unnecessary. The fourth change: liberation from archonic influence. The archons, whether understood as actual entities or as patterns of fear-based thinking, operate through identification with the material self. When that identification ends, their leverage ends. They cannot threaten what cannot be harmed. They cannot tempt what recognizes material pursuits as empty. They cannot confuse what sees through illusion. The awakened person still lives in the material world, still interacts with systems of power and control, but does so from a position of inner freedom. External circumstances cannot grant or remove what you are. Mystics across traditions describe this final stage similarly. Plotinus wrote of union with the One. The soul is no longer conscious of the body or of itself as having form. It knows itself as a thought that has become what it thinks. Meister Eckhart described the soul breaking through to the Godhead, recognizing itself as what God is in essence. Ramana Maharshi spoke of the self realizing itself. That which remains when everything else is removed is the self. The Gnostic texts promise that when the spark fully awakens, the return begins. Not necessarily immediate bodily death, but the process of disentangling from material identification until, at death, the spark ascends through the archonic spheres, no longer subject to their influence, returning to the pleroma from which it fell. What descended in ignorance ascends in knowledge. What fell asleep awakens. What forgot remembers. And in that remembering, the entire purpose of the descent is fulfilled. The monad experiencing itself through separation, then recognizing itself again through reunion. You are that return, happening now. The divine spark is not metaphor. It is the oldest teaching humanity has ever known, hidden in mystery schools, encrypted in scriptures, whispered by mystics, and buried under centuries of spiritual amnesia. It is the secret that terrifies institutions because it places ultimate authority not in churches, not in governments, not in books, but inside you. Inside every human being burns a fragment of the monad, the highest source. Small, silent, easily forgotten, yet powerful enough to shatter illusion, break the grip of the archons, and reconnect you to what the Gnostics called the true God. The journey of awakening begins when you remember who you truly are, not the body that will dissolve, not the thoughts that come and go, not the personality constructed from experience, but the awareness observing all of it, the light that was present before you were born and will remain after the body falls away. This recognition changes everything. It liberates you from fear, from external control, from the endless pursuit of material satisfaction that never satisfies. It reveals that you were never separate from what you were seeking. It acknowledges the divine consciousness that exists as your deepest nature. In the next video, we explore a figure who tried to ignite this spark in every person he met. A teacher whose message was altered, censored, and hidden for centuries. If you're ready to go deeper into this forbidden story, subscribe and turn on notifications, because what comes next may change how you see Jesus forever. Until next time, keep questioning. Good night.